Okay, so thanks for Chris for putting that together for us. We do have Chris Stark here with us, and we're going to do something we haven't done in this assembly before by having a question and answer session with Chris actually open in the whole room here. So, but what we're going to do, because as you'll realise, there's 139 people on this call, everyone can't just start speaking at once. So what we've done is we've opened up the chat, and that's where we're going to ask people to start thinking about putting their questions in. So if you click on the little chat icon, the little speech bubble that's usually at the bottom of your screen, or you might need to scroll down to find it, click on it, it should open up and you'll be able to, you should be able to put in questions there that we can start collecting for Chris. So, and the other thing is, even if you don't have a question that you want to follow up with him on, if you see a question in there that somebody else has written and you think, actually, that's a really good one, let us know, because it might be the case that we end up, we might have more questions than we're actually able to answer. If anyone does have a problem being able to use the chat, then please do sort of, put your hand up or give us a wave. And so you're putting in the questions. So the questions are there for everyone. So everyone will be able to see all the questions that are in the chat. And Kelly and I are going to be sort of reading through them with you and putting some to Chris on your behalf. And a reminder to Chris, we're starting to see some questions coming in. So we don't have a lot of time. So I'm going to ask you to try and be as concise and as brief with your answers as you can be.
Do my best.
Just so we can get through as many as we can. So over to Kelly. Started seeing some of them pop up there.
Hi, yes, so I'm going to read two questions out. The first question is, why are we cutting down trees for development when they do so much for climate change? And the second question is, if this is going to be cost neutral, why do you think it is even needing to be debated? And of course, please do answer to the best of your ability, but it's okay if you don't know the answer to some.
So firstly, on trees, so hugely important part of the story that I was trying to tell you in the video that I put together for you, because as I mentioned, that's the net in net zero. So we do need to store carbon in the natural world. So cutting down trees might seem like a strange strategy, but one of the goals really is to have sustainable timber production. So planting trees, yes, cutting them down, preferably using them in construction itself. So when you use that timber in a building, if you're building something, that's a really solid place to store carbon for a very long time. So the average life of a building in this country is something as long as 700 years, if you look how little we pull down buildings that we put up. So imagine those buildings have lots of timber in them. That becomes a really good place to store carbon for a long time. So once that tree has been cut down, we replace it with another tree, and that's the key thing. So you have a way of drawing more carbon out of the atmosphere. But it's important to say that doesn't just happen by magic. So we have to plan that very carefully. And one of the other issues that runs alongside this is the cutting down of old forests and ancient forests, which is not a good move for the climate and something we should only do in very carefully considered circumstances. So what we need when it comes to timber and forestry is a really careful strategy. It's not just about throwing up trees as though they are kind of technology to store carbon. They've got to be put in the right place. They've got to be, the use for that timber, if we're going to use it for timber, has got to be carefully thought through. And the crucial point is that those new trees need to be the kind of trees that we would have typically in Scotland, so that we preserve the natural benefits of having there, the biodiversity benefits, as they're sometimes called. So that's the tree story. I'm happy to talk more about it. The second one on the question of if it's going to be cost neutral, why is it even being debated? That's such a good question. So the key thing that comes out of our most recent work is the story that I just tried to talk you through in very brief outline, which is the really quite amazing outcome of our most recent work, which looks at that story of the investment costs, which are themselves very significant. So that's £50 billion a year, scaling up from about £10 billion that we invest at the moment to £50 billion a year by 2030. Scotland's about a tenth of that. It slightly outperforms its population share because we've got to do more investment in Scotland for some of the things that we think the UK will need to get to net zero than in other parts of the country. So thinking about that sum of money, it's a lot of money. But the other kind of part of the story, which we were very excited to tell in December, is that that does reveal these savings, these cost savings in operating these technologies that are the things that will get us to net zero. The consumer should save in fuel costs. We're not spending money on fossil fuels. We're typically spending money on electricity, which happens to be a cheaper form of generation now into the future. We think that renewable electricity will be cheaper than any other form of electricity. So that's a really great outcome, but it's an aggregate outcome. So when you net those two things off at the level of the whole economy, you get to this very low number overall of less than 1% of the size of the economy in any one year. It's closer to zero in actual fact. But that doesn't mean that there aren't real costs somewhere. So I'll just give you very briefly an example of what I mean by that. So the story on transport is immensely positive now. So we think that moving to electric cars and moving away from cars altogether is cost saving in comparison to continuing to drive petrol and diesel cars in perpetuity into the future. So that's an amazing thing too. We weren't talking that way about it just a few years ago, but that we now think is a saving to the economy. That contrasts with one of the other areas where we've got a very big cost to the economy, and that's the cost of decarbonising our buildings. So one of the challenges is actually in spreading that cost between those areas where we've got that kind of saving. The two big savings that we see are in the power sector. So it's cheaper, we think, to go low carbon in power than it is to not. And in transport, two big cost savings there, and two big costs in decarbonising industry and in decarbonising buildings. So although the overall cost is low, that masks the fact that within that there are some very big costs and some very big benefits and savings elsewhere. So that's a challenge that you need to meet with probably tax policies to spread those things out a bit more.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions in the chat there. There's definitely a couple of questions about sort of carbon capture as well. Is a sort of a reality, a viability there? And also, I suppose, about what is counted within the carbon footprint in terms of presumably exports, imports, and I've lost the word, the embedded carbon in our waste.
So, Kayla, I missed the first question. Could you go through the first question again? Sorry, I didn't hear it.
There was a couple of questions about carbon capture and whether it's actually a viable thing or a fantasy, really. And
then the second question was about what's counted in the targets.
Yeah, in terms of does it count imports and things that are not necessarily produced here and the full carbon life and value of products?
So carbon capture, let's deal with that first. So it's long been talked about, and indeed there are places around the world where carbon capture takes place. There's over 40 of them, but it hasn't really ever been demonstrated at the kind of scale that I've been talking about in my presentation and it's crucial to say that in many of the global pathways that are presented for addressing the Paris Agreement and the temperature targets that I know you've been talking about, carbon capture plays quite a big role. So it's one of those technologies that in our view, we think it would be very useful to have. So I'll just explain that. So if you're able to take a fossil fuel, burn it and capture the carbon, or to take a bioenergy crop, something that you've grown that has itself taken carbon from the atmosphere and capture that carbon, then that gives you a set of options to do things in the future that you wouldn't have otherwise. So one of those things, I won't go through them all, but one of those things is produce hydrogen. So you can produce hydrogen, which is a fuel that might have a use somewhere else. The problem with carbon capture is, firstly, it hasn't been proved at the kind of scale I've talked about, so I mentioned that. And secondly, that it's not a zero carbon process. So when you capture that carbon, most of it you can capture, we think, but some of it will escape. So you've got to do something somewhere else to make sure that you've mopped that carbon up. Now, understandably, people are suspicious of that. I'm suspicious of it too. But when we've looked at it in our work, what we see is that at each stage of the carbon capture process, we're doing something that we do understand. What we haven't done is link those things up in a kind of value chain. And we haven't worked out whether you can do it at scale, as I mentioned. And we haven't, crucially, worked out whether we can put policies in place that will encourage the industry of carbon capture to actually come into being and to continue into the future. Now, those are big, big challenges that should not be dismissed. Our view is that they can be fixed. We can get to that point. And I think the very final point I'll say on carbon capture is it is absolutely not a panacea. So if you think you can do it, it's still something that you should really only do if you absolutely must. So it's very much as a complement to the other much more effective strategies that are about reducing our emissions more generally. And I talked a lot about that in the video that you saw. On the question of the carbon targets and what we're counting, very clearly, this is quite a simple answer. The target that we have in Scotland and the target that we have for the whole of the UK is based on the emissions that are produced here in Scotland and in the UK. So it's within the geographical borders. So it's basically, you could think of it as the emissions that we're producing mostly from burning fossil fuels within the UK. But we have a much bigger carbon footprint, as it's sometimes called, the thing that we are responsible for globally. So think of all the things that we import and use and consume here in Scotland. They come from other parts of the world, and there will be a carbon impact from the production of those things. So we don't count those broader carbon emissions in the targets that we have in Scotland, but we should look at them when we're thinking about the overall strategy for climate change. And that's something that we in the CCC, my institution, have been thinking more and more about in the advice that we've been offering to government. But formally, the targets are about production emissions, as they are sometimes called.
Thanks so much, Chris. Okay, 2 more questions, one of which had support from a few members. The first is, what do you think would be the most effective thing for people to give up to help mitigate climate change? And the second that had quite a bit of support is, if the Assembly was only allowed to make one recommendation to the Scottish Parliament, what would you want us to recommend?
Gosh. In terms of what you can give up, so maybe a very brief tour on that. So what we consume is a very big part of the story of how we get to net zero. So cutting our consumption of those things that cause high emissions is going to be a very important part of the strategy overall. Basically, we need to reduce the size of this overall challenge so that we can then have strategies to cut the remaining emissions after we've done that. In the chart I showed you, the rainbow chart, the top 2 stripes were about changing our consumption. So the purple stripes at the top were about reducing our consumption of high carbon goods. And by 2050 or 2045, when we're thinking about Scotland, that makes up a relatively small proportion of the emission savings that in our assessments we think would be necessary. But in the early years, it's making up about half of the emissions reductions. So it's hugely important in the short term. And it makes the overall task easier, as I mentioned. So in terms of what we need to give up or at least reduce, it's very much about how we travel and what we eat, and maybe perhaps a little bit about the choices that we make about heating our homes. So consumption of red meat and dairy is a really big part of your personal carbon footprint, and also travel. So driving in a car, and especially if you travel in a plane a lot. So reducing your plane travel is a really important part of reducing your overall carbon footprint. And that opens up a very interesting discussion about who travels extensively by plane, and whether we might actually have a smaller group of people who might need to travel less more often and have a bigger impact overall in the consumption patterns, and that those purple stripes that I talked about. I've forgotten the second question, Kelly, I'm sorry. It's terrible.
If you could make one recommendation, the one, to the Scottish Parliament, what would it be?
I cannot answer that question. God, I wish I could, but I recently gave evidence to the Scottish Parliament about the recent plans that the Scottish Government have brought together, and it was a bit of approval, of a bit of kind of pleased. I was pleased about some elements of the plan, but the bit I kind of least pleased with, if I can put it that way, is that there was a lot of kind of guesswork, I think, about how we meet that 2030 target that I talked about. And we think that the 2030 target that's in the Scottish Climate Change Act is incredibly tough. And again, it can be met. But I think given that it's a statutory target, that means it has to be met. It's the law of the land. I was a bit disappointed in the state of the plan overall and how we were going to meet it, given that it's only 10 years away. So if I had one thing, it would be to tighten up the plans for the next 10 years. We really, really need to see what the plans of Scottish ministers are to meet that goal, which is only now, well, actually it's 9 years away, isn't it, when we think about it that way. So my overall plan, it's not a great answer, I'm afraid, for the purposes of your recommendations, but I would like a better plan.
Okay, we might have time for just sort of one more question there. And there was one that came up about, that it looks like businesses are going to have to bear and share some of these costs. And how confident are we that they're, making these right moves towards starting to share plans to become carbon neutral or carbon negative? And how effective do you think that will be, and what sort of impacts?
Yeah, this is probably the most interesting area of my work recently, is that we see the importance of the business community in this story overall. So I talked about the size of the overall investment that's required for the UK and for Scotland to get to net zero, but the most of that investment will be done in the first instance by businesses. So it's going to be a big step for them to make those kind of investments. Now, you are the consumer will pay for some of those investments. So think about the big investments in the energy sector, for example, all the wind farms that we'll need, all the hydrogen production that we might have in the future, the carbon capture that we've talked about. It will be businesses that are investing in the steps that will cut emissions, but somehow that's got to be recovered from the consumer. And the other thing that's coming about alongside all of this is this thing that really remarkable in the last couple of years, really 2 or 3 years, we've seen big corporate commitments to net zero itself. So that's something that wasn't happening even sort of 3 or 4 years ago, but there was a real movement now towards these big corporate commitments. And that's another area where there's a lot of suspicion, rightfully, I think, about what those net zero targets are. But I think it's also an area where we might see lots more rapid progress. Think about the impact that a global multinational corporation might have if it genuinely tries to get its emissions to zero. Probably more important than most countries' plans for tackling climate change would be if that was a real plan. So I think it is important that the business community do kind of 2 things. I suppose one is that they sign up to these to credible strategies for cutting their emissions, not just kind of a net zero stamp on the corporate plan, so they can take that to their shareholders. But secondly, they actually make these investments, are encouraged to do so. And I do think that it's that second part of it that here in Scotland we should work hard at. It's really important that we see not just corporate commitments to net zero, but real investment plans. Some of that will involve we, the taxpayer, helping them to make those investments because they wouldn't make them otherwise. But many of the investments that we might need will be better for the business themselves. So I'll just two examples of that. One we've talked about already, which is the move from petrol and diesel cars to electric cars. If you're a business with a fleet of cars, it's probably going to save you money to move to electric cars and to do that as quickly as possible. So that's an area where that kind of investment needs to just happen, and it's more about encouraging the business to make an investment that will save them money. And another area that's like that is farming. So many of the practices in farming that cut emissions are cost saving to the farmer. And therefore, it's remarkably, farmers don't know that often. So there's a kind of general interest here in making sure that businesses are aware of the opportunities, aware of the savings that might come from those things. And in the limited number of areas where those investments need to be supported by the state in some way, we should be really clear on why we're supporting the businesses to make those investments with taxpayer money. But again, we have that kind of evidence, and we should be able to bring those plans into place.
And it looks like we do have another sort of minute or two. Kelly, did you have another question lined up there?
Yes, it's another one that a few members have supported here, and it's around electric cars. So it says electric cars, environmental damage and workforce exploitation in the mining of rare earth minerals required for batteries, and also how you dispose of these minerals at the end of battery life are problems that seem to be sidestepped in any discussion of the move to e-cars. Have you got any thoughts or reflections on that?
Yeah, so I think it is true to say that they are often sidestepped, but more and more, I think that is a challenge that we've got to grips with. So I can only talk about the work that we've done in my own institution, the CCC. So we were for a long time quite reluctant to name an early date for the transition to electric vehicles. And one of the reasons for that is because we could see that the global supply of those vehicles was going to be limited by some of the issues that are in the kind of premise of the question. So the availability of minerals was a draw. Was a kind of constraint on building the supply chain for electric vehicles. So we could have in this country done what Norway did and given big fat subsidies through the tax system to move to electric vehicles, and it's been incredibly successful for Norway. So if you follow this at all, you'll see that they are having a remarkable rapid move to electric vehicles, but they're also mopping up a great proportion of the global supply of those vehicles. So we were a bit more reluctant in the CCC to give advice until we could be clear that there would be a sustainable supply chain and sustainable supply of especially the minerals for the batteries. So we've been looking at that, and we're very satisfied that there is enough out there. It's not that they're rare in that sense. The bigger issue is the ethical supply of those things, and that is a tougher challenge, I think. So one of the things we've been saying recently in our advice is that it's important to consider the ethical supply chain. So can you recover the necessary minerals for the batteries and the other parts of the car in such a way that you can be convinced that that is genuinely sustainable in all senses, that we're not exploiting people along that way. Now, that is not something that's easy to do from Scotland alone, but I do think it's important that many of these things will be imported. Most batteries are not going to be made in this country. So what we import, we should make sure that we've shone a light on as much as possible when it comes to those ethical supply chains. But the final point I'll make is just to repeat the last point, that the supply of it itself is the supply of the minerals that are necessary is not itself going to be a problem, we think. It's more about how they're recovered and the labor that's involved in places of the world where often it's difficult to say with certainty that it's been done in an ethical way.
Okay, well, I think there is still a lot of questions there in the chat, and we will have a look if there's some that actually, maybe we can get other answers to. Not going to say we're going to necessarily be able to answer all of them, but some of the more sort of specific ones we might be able to provide you as members with some additional information. We are going to have to wind up there very shortly. And thank Chris for coming and joining us and being put on the spot with quite a lot of questions going there. Chris, do you have any sort of just final words before we move on to just winding up for the rest of the day?
Well, just to say, I mentioned at the end of my little video that I really, really look forward to what you produce, and I was more involved in the UK's Climate Assembly, which I know that you've had referred to at various points in this process. I would love to have joined you earlier in this process, but we were producing that work that I've just skirted over in my presentation just at the end of December, and it's been really the product of about 2 or 3 years' work for for the CCC and my institution. So I'm so pleased I could at least come and speak to you. And I know it's late in the process, but it really is wonderful that you are giving up your time to do this. And we've seen with the UK's Climate Assembly how important the recommendations have become in framing up the thinking around climate change at UK level. So we have used that Assembly's work already in that work that we published in December extensively. So the recommendations of that Assembly have made their way already into the advice that we are required under the Climate Change Act to provide to ministers. I really, really hope that that's something we'll be able to do with your recommendations too. And I appreciate that you'll be feeding your recommendations directly into government, which is great. But we'll use it too in our assessments, and we consider it a form of data, I suppose, in the analysis that we do. It will make our recommendations better if we understand what your preferences are. So I really hope that you will come up with something that's as compelling as it was at UK level. I'm pretty sure you will. And as a Scot here in Glasgow, I have a particular interest in this process working as well as it possibly can to steer ministers towards the right kind of policies. So I wish you really well with it. And if there are any of these questions that we can follow up with offline, then I'll try my best to help with that.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris.